Hi, everybody. Welcome back. This is a bit of a surprise, right? I skipped right past Unit 3, Topic 3. I'm sorry for the bait and switch there. When I designed the class, I figured I needed 5 different lectures to get through the material here in the unit before we start on your region-specific look at the UN. But as I developed the lectures and the PowerPoint stuff, I realized I really didn't need that. So we'll count as the equivalent of a canceled class. That's something you never get in an online class that you sometimes get in person. Somebody gets sick or a professor travels or something, class is canceled. You're celebrating, hooray, hooray. So think of 3-3 as if class was canceled. You still get the takeaway, the reading and the bonus bit, but you don't have to actually have the lecture itself. Also, I need to tell you that this non-geographic considerations title is another poor one. I've had a poor one before a time or two when I didn't really quite describe what we were going to do. As you'll see, a bunch of what we're going to talk about today are non-geographic types of alliances and blocks, but there's some that are different kinds of geography. And what I mean by that is they're not based on the contiguous regional definitions of geography we've used so far this time, but there are some ways in which geography is used. So off we go, talking about this other way of looking at regions at the UN. So I don't really know what's going on with this recording system today. I apologize if I remain in the corner of your screen. I can't hide myself, and I do want to hide myself so you can just enjoy my dulcet tones and listen to the rest of the lecture. I'm starting here on this page revisiting the non-aligned movement, or the NAM. This is something we talked about back in Unit 1 in regards to the Cold War, and again in Unit 2. So these are the states which were neither aligned with the US in the First World or the Soviets in the Second World, but they were the Third World, non-aligned. And so they have strategic meetings really talking about peace and trying to find a way in the world, but they're not a formal bloc at the United Nations by and large. They do have some meetings where they are present as an organized group, but most of those states also are in something called the G77. The Group of 77, which is a formal grouping of developing states at the United Nations, and they do some interesting work on all sorts of fronts. So they have sort of two places where they really come to the fore. So one is in development topics, where instead of regionally grouping by geography, you're going to group up as the developing states. So that's the G77. And the second is to speak up on behalf of the collective developing states who don't necessarily have the time, the resources, the money, the personnel to put towards all the issues in the world and need a group to speak for it. In other words, there's a lot of topics which, if you're in the big Western states or a state that has just more resources, even if they're in the developing world like Nigeria or Indonesia or South Africa or a state like that, Brazil, Argentina, if you're a smaller state, there will be topics that come up that you just don't have time, ability, personnel to put towards. For example, a few years ago, my group at UI and WC was meeting with the Timorese mission to the UN, where we were talking to them about their position on maritime security. They have an interest in maritime security, particularly where they're located, sort of at the edge of Asia and Oceania, where lots of drug running and things happen. But they didn't have a boat. They don't have a boat to put in to run maritime security. So they had a hard time having a position because they didn't have a way to implement a position. And so you sort of back up and they let the G77 position on maritime security become their position on maritime security. One of the things that the G77 issued a couple of statements on 2 years ago was the emergence of something known as lethal autonomous weapon systems, killer robots, which I think I mentioned once before in this class. Each individual state in the G77 hasn't had time to formulate a position on that, but they let the G77 statement speak for them. So this is a group, as you see on this map, that encompasses much of the world. It's actually the largest bloc at the United Nations, but it's not always an active bloc. To understand when a bloc will come to the fore, when it will take action, and when it will defer to regional or other sorts of cultural kinds of concerns, you have to look at the mandate, you have to look at the purpose for the reason for existence, and all the overlapping memberships that a state might have to figure out which group is liable to come to the fore. You also have the case, which you read about and listened to the bonus bit last unit, where an ad hoc group or alliance or bloc can come together and then fade back to the fore. So the G77, about 135 member states, largest voting bloc at the UN, but not always an active voting bloc. Post-colonial memberships are another way that you get blocs at the United Nations or elsewhere. So there are a couple of formal alliances through the Commonwealth. So these are the United Kingdom and its former colonies who are still members. Periodically, groups leave. For example, the Gambia left the Commonwealth not too long ago. They didn't like the relationship any longer. There's also something called the Organisation Internationale of la Francophonie, or the Francophone world. So this is France and its former colonies that wish to be part of it. So these are formal alliances, but they only come to the fore on certain kinds of topics, particularly culture-related topics, and they share some commonality there, so they will be active. So there are times when the Commonwealth emerges as a bloc, fades back away. The Francophonie comes as a bloc, fades back away. But they are formal alliances. It's just whether they're active on topics or not at the UN. They have ongoing common meetings outside the UN. It's whether they come to the fore ever at the UN. The one that's almost always informal and intermittent, there's been some talk, is both a Hispanic affiliation or former colonies of Spain. They don't do much. But the one that has done some things in recent years is the Lusophone countries. Lusophone being the Portuguese-speaking colonies, of which there are 7 former colonies and plus Portugal. They don't really ever have a presence at the UN except on sort of promotion of culture. This is different than what I just mentioned before. The Commonwealth and the Francophonie may have a presence on discussion and debate about cultural things, but you would find, for example, in at the UN they run different art displays and cultural days and stuff like that. The Lusophone countries come together on that, but not much other places. But the post-colonial is a place where you might find a region or a bloc. Then you could find things through culture and or heritage, coming out of culture and or heritage. So on the one hand, you've got something like the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. Or Organization of Islamic Cooperation. They recently changed their name from Organization of the Islamic Conference to Organization for Islamic Cooperation, the OIC. So these are states which have self-determined to be Muslim or consider Islam to be a key enough component of who they are that they want to be part of this organization. It has 4 main purposes, so it'll only come to the fore at the UN when those 4 topics come to the fore. And otherwise, they will then pertain to other blocs and alliances on other topics. The OIC has states in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas are all in this group. And they're very disparate. I mean, you have Indonesia, which is the largest democracy in the world, that's a Muslim state. You have Brunei, which is a small sultanate. You have the quasi-religious states that are in different parts of the world, and it's just a crazy agglomeration, except where they overlap on these certain topics. So you could look that up and see what those are. Similar to that, and with certainly an overlap of membership, is the League of Arab States, which is also cultural. Even though it looks like it's a continuous geography, it is a cultural grouping. You'll see, well, you can't see it. If I'm still on the screen, I apologize. There is the Comoros, which is not contiguous. There's also a strange thing you might see on this map. If you ever noticed this place called Western Sahara, which is a UN trust territory, one of those 17 non-self-governing territories I told you about before, the League of Arab States, or the Arab League, sort of has grouped that in with their own territory, which it oughtn't be, but if you look at their official maps, it is. So these are culture and heritage-based organizations that do come to the fore on certain topics and try to have common positions. I got a reading for you this time about the Arab League and Syria and what its role might be in trying to force a change in the way Bashar al-Assad acts there in the Syrian civil war. So here's the quasi-geography, the other geography piece, which would be small island developing states and landlocked states who have very interesting overlapping interests on certain topics. So the UN has an office of the representative for least developed, landlocked, and small island developing states. So the SIDS are one that is more of a latecomer. It started as least developed and landlocked states is what the office started as, and then encompasses small island developing states as a separate geographical region. So landlocked states have very interesting challenges in terms of their economies, because as you lack coastal access, and you have to cross at least one and maybe more borders to get to your territory, the cost of goods goes up quite significantly. And so just your ability to act and interact in the global economy is impacted by being a landlocked state. You also don't have the option of gathering resources from your contiguous ocean, or in doing some other things that are facilitated by having a coast, particularly a coast that's not frozen. In one of Russia's big challenges is that they haven't always had a warm water port. That's why Crimea is of interest to them and other places. Anyway, landlocked states face challenges that get exacerbated in an era with climate change progressing, which is why the small island developing states are also a collective region. So these are they're not islands like Australia is an island or Indonesia is an island. They're islands like the Pacific, the Caribbean. There's some Mediterranean states, some Indian Ocean states. These are places where they have to group together to develop a common voice, because climate change and rising ocean levels are not just an esoteric question for them. Like, oh, we're Holland, we'll build dikes and we'll build ways in which to keep out the sea. You're talking about sea rise in a place like the Maldives, where the highest point is in the tens of feet, where it's the end of your country as the islands disappear into the water. So they have this collective voice as small island developing states. On the one hand, not a contiguous geographic region, or one that will lead to election to UN bodies, because those are those contiguous geographic questions we looked at the beginning of this unit, but they are geographical questions after all. So there's lots of reasons to group up, and what you have to pay attention to is the topic at hand, and it's one in which understanding what the group does, the block, the alliance, the organization, whatever, what it does and what its goals are will tell you when and what they're liable to come to the fore as an active voting block at the UN about. When we looked, for example, in this unit at something like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, on issues of peace and security, they may come to the fore differently than the Europe and the Americas would, or WEOG would, because it'll be a NATO grouping. In this case, the Organization for the Islamic Conference, or for Islamic Cooperation, comes together often on questions of Palestinian statehood and on the issue of the way Muslims are treated abroad. So if the topic at the UN is one where you're looking at the rights of Muslim migrants around the world, or Islamophobia, the OIC's there. But if it's a question about economic development around the world, then they will default to other blocks, other alliances, and they won't be to the fore. So reasons for grouping up abound. There's different things, different rationales, and different groups, and it's up to you as you go along to figure out when those are most likely, or to pay attention. You don't have to be predictive. You can look at the back. But when you're looking at your regions for this unit, you'll be looking at all the blocks and alliances they're a member of, and they're determining when that particular alliance will come to the fore.